All right, everyone. Hello. Welcome to what I think is one of the last sessions in this crash course. This session is on decolonizing economics, question mark, very importantly. So my name is Meixieira Groenewald. I am lecturing, or at least doing this recording for you of this lecture in South Africa. I have been born and raised in South Africa. We'll talk more about my positionality in a second. But really what I wanted to encourage all of you to think through in the next hour of this lecture, and I will try not to be a typical academic who goes over the 1 hour that I've been allocated, but that I'm really hoping that this lecture is for you a journey in questioning. I had said this in the abstract of the lecture that I had put together, that really I hope at the end of this you will have many more questions than what you will have answers. I think particularly because this is a very new conversation that economics is having in terms of decolonizing, and that we approach it with humility, that we ask a lot of questions. As you will hopefully see throughout this lecture, that there is a lot of unlearning to be done. But so hopefully it's also going to be interesting and engaging for you. I have tried to put in alternative sources of knowledge other than just academic journal articles. I had toyed a little bit with the idea of making the mandatory readings not be a single reading, and for us to have some poetry, some music, some artwork, and for that to be what is your core content. But I thought that perhaps it is better for us to have a discussion and to intersperse that throughout the lecture. Maybe a little bit of too much of a shock to the system, if that is what I had recommended, right, for your core content. Right. So let's get started. Right. Let me firstly just pause for a moment in terms of positionality. So I think that it is massively important for me to acknowledge my own positionality, because that will color and influence and shape my understanding of the world and indeed of the decolonial process. So as is probably quite evident, even though I have been born and raised in South Africa, I'm certainly white, and along with it comes a massive amount of privilege. Also cishet, even though I would be working class in South Africa because of the massively skewed income distribution, I would certainly be upper middle income. And so all of these are my realities, but as I say, they do certainly shape the way in which I understand the world. And so one of the wonderful things about, us being able to lecture online and for us to have so many participants, as I understand, from all over the world, we do, as many of you will probably have experienced, have the difficulties of, now that things are online, we lose some of that interaction and our ability to connect in perhaps ways that we previously would have. And so I would really encourage when we do have a more interactive session where you can ask questions and share insights, and where we can hopefully co-create around this idea about what it means to decolonize economics. And that if any participants feel that I have overstepped or that I have misrepresented, that I would really welcome being addressed on this. So please, please, please feel free to do so when we do actually have the opportunity to engage more. But so just a little bit about my education previously, which is what drives a lot of my enthusiasm around us asking questions of how to decolonize economics, was a very mainstream, overwhelmingly neoclassical undergraduate and postgraduate training in economics here in South Africa. And so in my attempt to be able to seek alternative approaches, shall I say, I became aware of SOAS, the University of London, School of Oriental and African Studies, and I completed my MSc in the political economy of development there. Perhaps, as the African philosopher Ndlovu talks about, this reality that scholars from the global south go off to the global north to receive training in the northern intellectual frameworks, to then get published in northern journals. And so I will say that that was not necessarily my intention, but I do think that SOAS did a wonderful thing in opening me up to alternative frameworks, whilst feeling really passionate about asking questions. I have been told, that I am limiting my career by returning here to South Africa and entering into academia, and that I should hurry up and do my PhD at an institute in the global north as quickly as possible, and that if I want to be a real serious academic, that's where I should go. But I have made different decisions, and so I'm actively choosing to pursue a career here in the global south. I have many things to consider in terms of doing my PhD, but this is really where my enthusiasm for this topic comes about, because having experienced a lot of the education that I had here in South Africa, this is not to say that there is not some hopeful spots that things are changing in terms of our economics curriculum, albeit much too slowly, but really that I felt as if the lived realities of my own life was not reflected in the economics curriculum. And not just of my own life, but of my friends and my community. And so this really is what pushed me to ask questions about why it is that I felt so uncomfortable with the economics curriculum that I was being taught. And with when I returned back from London and started lecturing full-time here in South Africa, what it was about what I was teaching and what I was encouraged to research, what were questions that I was even allowed to ask as an economist, and what were questions that I was not allowed to ask because this is not what economists do. That this is really what drove my interest in the field of postcolonial and decolonial thought. Right, so let's move on then to the structure of the lecture. As I had said, I'm really hoping that there's going to be lots of questions to ask. I think part of breaking down the hierarchies of knowledge and of expertise is not to see the person who happens to be giving the lecture as the fount of all knowledge, and that I have all this knowledge to, through the process of osmosis or diffusion, give to you, and then you shall leave a filled vessel, right? But really, just for this to be the starting point for us to co-create around ideas of what it might mean to decolonize economics. So really for us to ask many questions. We will have some discussions around the theorizing of decolonizing. I think fascinating literature that exists on this, and some that I would like to highlight, hopefully so that I can learn from the participants of this crash course as well, yes. Then I think really interesting for us to look at how different disciplines have actually engaged on this topic of the post-colonial and decolonial. And economics, absolute lack of engagement on this. Although, again, I think that there are some hopeful signs that this is slowly changing. Not within the mainstream, but at least within, shall we say, heterodox or alternative or pluralist approaches to economics. Then for us to look at how do we decolonize the teaching of economics, but much more broadly than just what happens necessarily in a formal university classroom. We will take a look at that towards the end of the lecture, because I do understand that there are a fair amount of students, whether it be undergraduate or postgraduate, that are part of this course. But also just for us to ask some questions around how do we decolonize the teaching of economics in terms of how we teach ourselves. And how the teaching of economics takes place, perhaps within our workplaces and within our communities. And a little bit on the caution that I would like to have us all think about in terms of actually using the word decolonization, and what exactly, when it might be better to use this word and when not. Right, so that is the idea behind the structure of the lecture. Let's see. So certainly I think it is important for us to just think through this concept of binaries. So Groenewald talks about the inhuman tidiness of a binary world. And so, sometimes in order to be able to abstract, creating and using these words or these binaries such as colonizer and colonized, the global north and the global south, the west, the rest, developing, developed, Eurocentrism to decenter Eurocentrism. I think that they are sometimes necessary for us to use, and they are sometimes accurate and representative and useful. But I do think that it is worth, just as Ochoa, I like very much so to have the actual quotes from the book, chapters, journal articles, blog posts, tweets, speeches that I am using to really not misrepresent the words of the scholars, and I use scholars very broadly, that I'm drawing from. But talking about coloniality and this result really of coloniality, promoting these binary stereotypes and really validating the values of the colonizer over those of the subaltern. And so post-colonial thinking then, should offer an alternative way of viewing the world that is no longer divided into the colonizer and the colonized. Yes. But so I would really emphasize that as we are going through this, when binaries are being discussed, to ask when it is that they are actually relevant and useful and accurate, whatever those words may mean to you, but to acknowledge that there are many, many instances where these binaries are not useful. And I think that it is quite important when asking, a specific research question that you may have, a specific question just in your life. It doesn't necessarily need to conform to within the academy, but to have in the back of our minds at the very least, to think through when is this binary useful and when is it not? And when is it very necessary for us to break away from these binaries, whilst acknowledging that, sometimes within post-colonial and even decolonial thought that these binaries do still come through. Right. I have put here two quotes that I would love for us to just pause on for a moment. And, as economists, and again, I struggle sometimes with even identifying as an economist. I don't know. I would love to hear from all of you how you feel about being identified as an economist, or whether you do not identify as an economist. But, if you have had formal training in economics, we are often encouraged to be seen as objective and to have this neutrality, this universality around economics, to definitely not feel, to not be emotional around this. And this is what makes the good economist, right? So over-reliance on quantitative mathematical modeling, all these. But I would hope that you could just pause for a moment, allow yourself to feel, as difficult as that may sometimes be for economists, when we are reading these words. So this is a quote from Klostanova and Ndlovu, and they are drawing on this principle that actually guides the Intercultural University of the People and Nations of Ecuador. And this university, founded in Ecuador, works on this principle called Amatwewasi, which is learning to unlearn in order to relearn, being this crucial principle. And when I had first read this phrase, it just struck me so powerfully, just how much it is that we need to unpack if we're talking about decolonizing more broadly and then decolonizing economics more specifically. How it is that we are supposed to even go about the process of learning to be able to unlearn in order to be able to relearn. And I think that hopefully this is a useful way for you to perhaps deal with what might be uncomfortable as we go through this lecture, as you perhaps delve more into the contributions within this field, yes? Then there is a wonderful South African academic, Ndlovu-Gatsheni, and this is from a different piece, not the one that was one of the mandatory readings, but talking about epistemic freedom, which Ndlovu-Gatsheni sees as a massively important component within the larger decolonization project. That epistemic freedom is about democratizing knowledge from its current rendition into the singular, into its plural, known as knowledges. And to really pause for a moment on this concept of knowledges, which within economics, and I would say not even just within economics, but it is a concept so far, and I see that I purposefully actually left this not in presentation mode, but for you to be able to see the number of times that words are just highlighted in red in Microsoft PowerPoint. And so apparently this word of knowledge is being so foreign that it must be highlighted as incorrect here in Microsoft's PowerPoint, yes? But for us to move away from this idea of the singular knowledge and to really ask ourselves, what would it mean to encompass an understanding that is, at the very least, epistemological in terms of knowledges, right? Hopefully that this will guide some of your thinking as we are moving through the rest of the lecture. So I thought perhaps it would be interesting for us to just quickly take a look at images, which can tell many stories, even if this is a quick Google image search. If you are to just put in decolonize, although I'm sure this might be different for different people, depending on what the algorithms have done to your Google image search. But at least for mine, what comes up when typing in decolonization is a lot of different, shall we call them, areas of focus in terms of decolonizing. So decolonizing social work, decolonizing fitness, went down a very deep, dark rabbit hole to be able to understand what was being discussed under the topic of decolonizing fitness, decolonizing the music room, decolonizing the internet, and then perhaps a little bit ironically, to keep calm and to decolonize everything. All this to really be a springboard to acknowledge that this has become a topic, at least more recently, and as a particularly powerful word, I would argue even a rallying cry around specifically this word of decolonization, much more so than post-colonial. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the lecture. And perhaps I'm too influenced by the 2015 and 2016 Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall protests that were sparked here in South Africa, where students were calling for a free decolonized education. And since, at least in South Africa, but I mean more globally, we have seen this with the Black Lives Matter, and so too with discussions around roads must fall internationally, that there is something happening in this moment that is really driving this conversation around decolonization. Has it become mainstream yet? Certainly not, but that there is, shall we say, a lot of excitement around this. Whether that excitement actually translates into action, whether it is actually in line with what the literature around decolonization would advocate for, these are all questions that we can ask, and that I do not think have clear and definitive answers, but definitely a point of discussion. So just for a moment, we're going to look at a lot of academic texts, whether it be journal articles or book chapters, about what does decolonization mean from within academia, even though there is this tension of what it can mean inside and outside of academia, and whether those binaries are necessarily helpful. But I would want you to pause for a moment, to pause the lecture, write it down, speak it out loud, to ask yourself, what does decolonization mean to you? What are the words, the phrases, the concepts, the ideas, the feelings, the emotions that come up? And then what might this mean for those outside of the more formal academia? What might it mean if you were to tell your family, your neighbors, your friends, yes, I'm going to listen to this 1 hour lecture now on decolonization. What might that mean to communities, to the general public? And do we only accept that decolonization as the theorizing around it, that there is this knowledge which comes in the neatly packaged academic journal articles or academics writing books, or can decolonization and its multiple meanings and dimensions be different or similar if we were to ask people outside of, shall we call it, the formal academia? Questions that I have, and I would be very keen for us to discuss further. Right, but so I have quite a few definitions in the upcoming slides, where I am, without attempting to belabor the point, really wanting to show you in their own words the different ways in which decolonization is being represented. And as we go through these conceptualizations, I wonder if it would perhaps be helpful for you to ask yourself these following questions. So which of these conceptualizations actually resonates most strongly with you, and why might that be the case? And are there convergences and divergences between the conceptualization of decolonization? We will have discussions a little bit more about how this looks in different disciplines, and also part of the core content or mandatory reading of Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni in his 10 Ds of the decolonial turn, to also just reflect for a moment on the de-disciplining. Right, but perhaps just to keep those two questions in mind as we go through the various definitions, because in just being as honest and open and upfront as what I can be, and as academics, we are often expected to just know things and therefore not to admit these sorts of tensions that exist. In my own journey was trying to ask, what does decolonization mean? And what does it mean specifically for economics? That there is this tension for me of not wanting to be prescriptive about decolonization, whilst trying to grapple with this not being everything and nothing, right? Well, this is not unique to the conceptualizations around decolonization, but to be open and upfront, which I would love for us to have a further discussion on, if we are trying to draw some sort of boundaries of what decolonization is and is not, how blurry are these boundaries? Does decolonization look different for different disciplines? These sorts of questions. This is not the only tension within decolonization, but one of them that I would love for us to discuss further. And just to, I am assuming that there is, I'm kind of giving a lay of the land here, and that there is not much prior knowledge necessarily on decolonization. But if you are very well versed in this, feel free to skip ahead in the lecture. But to remember that this is surrounded by discussions on what it means to diversify, to democratize. Much of the debates and the discussions that started with rethinking economics here in South Africa, most recently, the past 3 or 4 years, we have had rethinking economics for Africa, and all of this centered around discussions about pluralism, curriculum reform specifically, about democratizing economics so that economics is not something that is only studied in the hallowed halls of universities, and to say that it is surrounded by these discussions of diversifying, democratizing, of pluralism, but that diversifying, at least for me, is not sufficient, nor is pluralism sufficient to be able to encompass what I think is a very rich conceptual framework that the decolonial and postcolonial gives us. But as I say, I would be so eager to hear your perspectives on this later. Right, so here are some quotes. I would have loved it if I could actually, instead of me having to read this, have gotten the authors to have read these quotes and for me to play you this. I think there is something so astounding about being able to hear instead of only read how it is that authors that have written works would speak this, their inflections, tone of voice, their facial expressions, which I think have hidden layers of meaning that we do not always get when knowledge has been packaged into these forms of, it must be in the written word, something that we can read, and we do so quietly. So perhaps you would want to pause and read this out loud to yourself. I don't know. But I do think a very important point, at least for me, in this definition, which Bamba Gabriel and Nkalu is talking through here, is decolonizing involving a multitude of definitions, interpretations, aims, and strategies. And so then acknowledging that multiplicity of definitions, interpretations, and aims, though, to perhaps try to draw the boundaries then a little more tightly, that it is a way of thinking about the world which takes colonialism, empire, and racism as its empirical and discursive objectives of study. If you do identify as an economist, I would encourage you, as you are reading these definitions, shall we say, for lack of a better word, these conceptualizations around decolonization, to start to ask yourself, when we see the way that this is conceptualized and what we know about the economics discipline, where we might start to see why it is that at least mainstream economics, but this is not to say that all heterodox economics is excluded from this, where it is that there might be some very real pushback, all the way to an absolute denial of the decolonial framework being at all useful or relevant for economics, yes? So to resituate these phenomena as key shaping forces of the contemporary world, and it purports to offer alternative ways of thinking about the world. Within these broad contours, decolonizing remains a contested term consisting of a heterogeneity of viewpoints, approaches, political projects, normative concerns. This multiplicity of perspectives should not be surprising, given the various historical and political sites of decolonization that span both the globe and 500 years of history. I think this is a wonderful way to start the discussion, but to just think through how uncomfortable, and in some of the worst cases when we see people saying, well, decolonization means nothing, actually, that what is decolonization even really? What does this entail? What does this mean? Some of the impatience there is around this, some of the absolute disregard around this topic. And I think that these, at least for me, these multiplicity of perspectives makes many people very uncomfortable to be able to hold in their mind many different, sometimes competing ideas, when we would like, I think some would like decolonization to be a very clean, neat checklist. Yeah. Right. So then for us to take a look at actually a scholar who is from Botswana, Bagele Chelisa. And so in her book, she says here that specifically focused on actually methodology, but decolonization is a process of centering the concerns and worldviews of the colonized other so that they understand themselves through their own assumptions and perspectives. It is an event and a process. I think, again, for me, what is interesting, this it being both an event and it being a process. That involves creating and consciously using various strategies to liberate the captive mind. I think this might again link to the idea about unlearning in order to be able to relearn from oppressive conditions that continue to silence, to marginalize the voices of the subordinated, the colonized, the non-Western societies that encountered European colonization. Again, I would encourage you to look to see what are some of the themes that overlap between the previous conceptualization and this one, where there is convergences and divergences. And so here in Linda Toure Smith's conceptualization of this is decolonization is a process. Again, I'm seeing this theme of process coming through for those that are impatient or those that would like, particularly often university management, that would like decolonization to happen within the space of a single semester, not enjoying the idea behind this being a process, which engages with imperialism and colonialism at multiple levels. The importance then about reclaiming history being a critical and essential aspect of decolonization. This book actually has, I think, an absolutely excellent discussion about the importance of understanding history, continuing to engage with history, something that economists are not particularly enthusiastic about doing, or just claiming that economics can be ahistorical, yes, but a very, very worthwhile read, I would say, at least. Coming to know the past, that has been part of the critical pedagogy of decolonization. It is to hold alternative histories, is to hold alternative knowledges. I highlighted this definition again because I think, again, allowing us to think through what knowledge is and what knowledges might mean. Decolonization, however, does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all theory or research or Western knowledge. And I put this in here because sometimes I think some of the more disingenuous ways in which people are providing commentary on decolonization is that it is to completely reject all knowledge from the West. But decolonial thought and theory and conceptualizations, indigenous scholars on this topic have been quite clear in expressing that it is not to negate everything that comes from the West, to impose a new type of imperialism, where we just reject everything that comes from the West or from the global North. And this is where I think discussions about pluralism and what real pluralism actually is, at least as I conceive of it, is not to simply say, well, we would reject all knowledge that comes from the West simply because it comes from the West, yes? So it is about centering our concerns and worldviews and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspective and for our own purposes. And sometimes you will see I have a little bit of postcolonial poetry that is coming up, but sometimes when I read the work around decolonization, it almost reads to me as if it is poetry. Something which economists, again, I would say, are not very keen to engage on or see as a legitimate form of knowledge. Right, and so then the last definition that I have here, which is part of your mandatory readings, is Ndlovu-Gatsheni, who talks about decolonization as a vast enterprise and it being multi-dimensional. If you have read this piece of the mandatory reading, is a response to Clapham, actually asking, well, what does decolonization mean within African studies? And Sabelo writing a response to this to really broaden the way in which we understand what decolonization means, really emphasizing this multidimensional aspect of it. At the center of decolonization, that there is inextricably intertwined ethical, methodological, epistemological, and political dimensions. Think about how loaded these words are if we were to use them amongst mainstream economists, right? But again, in trying to then draw the borders more tightly of what decolonization might mean, this is a 2020 piece, quite rare to be able to see perhaps a closer tightening of the 10 Ds of the decolonial term. I think there are some decolonial scholars that might be a little bit hesitant about whether this might be too prescriptive. I think these 10 Ds provide each one of them for some very, very interesting points of discussion: decanonization, deimperialization, but just for us to pause for a moment on de-disciplining, to liberate knowledge from disciplinary empires and academic tribes. To keep this in mind when we are taking a look at how different disciplines have approached this topic of decolonization. Not that I profess for what is coming up to be exhaustive of all the different disciplines, but just 2 or 3 that I was hoping to highlight. Right, so having taken a look at these different conceptualizations of decolonization, I thought I would pause for a moment, again, to ask ourselves what knowledges might entail, but to take a look at a piece of postcolonial poetry, actually. So this is a chapter, it's written by Emma Bird, and she is taking a look, in this chapter, really at how postcolonial poetry has been marginalized in comparison to actually postcolonial prose. Fascinating chapter to talk about why it is that poetry has been marginalized or silenced in comparison to some of the renown that has been given to more postcolonial prose, particularly within literature, and the prominence of it, whereas poetry does not seem in many instances to have done so, and trying to reflect again, I think, on knowledge, on knowledges, on power hierarchies, on the production and the dissemination of knowledge, and in what forms it comes. But so this poem by A.K. Ramanujan, an Indian poet, really being an allegory, of course, poetry very open to interpretation, yes, but an allegory for actually the postcolonial poem. And so this poem is this poem is actually titled "Small Scale Reflections on a Great House," which is really reflecting on the accumulation of objects and things and events and traditions in this house, and it really being then an allegory for what the post-colonial poem might be about in the form of this house. Nothing that ever comes into this house goes out. Things come in every day to lose themselves among other things, lost long ago among other things, lost long ago. And I think, at least for me, what really resonates for me with this poem, I would love it if this was a point of discussion that we could have in the session. But for us to think about within the post-colonial and decolonial thought, what it is that has been lost, what continues to remain lost, and how what has been lost might be useful for us in whatever it is that we may be asking as questions, whether it be more formal research questions, how it is that we're teaching, how it is that we're approaching research, how it is that we're approaching policy, for us to think through how what might have been seen as lost could potentially be able to be seen as knowledges again. Yes. So perhaps just a moment on the post-colonial and decolonial. This division is not always made explicit, and there is contestation on what are the differences between the post-colonial and between the decolonial. But so Bambara has this 2014 article, Post-Colonial and Decolonial Dialogues, trying to create distinctions, that the post-colonial is associated with specific diasporic scholars from the Middle East, from South Asia, that they are grappling with issues of the material, of the socio-economic, of the cultural, whereas decolonial, seen as often being associated with diasporic scholars, mainly from South America, that this is more closely linked with world systems theory, with underdevelopment theory, critical social theory, and again, to think through whether these binaries are helpful or useful or relevant or not. But I thought that the Sabelo and Ndlovu-Gatsheni article that I had given you was kind of laying the groundwork for many of the discussions around this, but actually criticism, not to say that Bambara has not done, I think, at least in my opinion, absolutely astounding and important, influential work, but a criticism particularly from Ndlovu-Gatsheni around ignoring the contribution from African and Black scholars, at least in my own teachings, what has been particularly helpful for me and useful, the work of Kwame Nkrumah in neocolonialism, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Mind, where there is much discussion now about decolonial. Sabelo also speaks about this, the sequencing of decolonization, where this was first a very political project. But now that there is much more discussion around this concept of decolonizing the mind. And so too the work of Samira Min not being acknowledged, right? So to see the debates that there are within the post-colonial and decolonial literature. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts on this and why it is that the African contributions within even this field are sometimes, perhaps they are not ignored, why it is that they are then not highlighted. And so Tlostanova and Mignolo have this quote that I think is perhaps useful also for us to think about. If sometimes we are trying to differentiate between the post-colonial and decolonial, if we find that a useful way for us to ask questions. So instead of the study or analysis of the existing post-colonial and neo-colonialist phenomena and processes, be it the diaspora, exile, nationalism, biopolitics, and maintaining the divide between the known object and the knowing subject, for the decolonial approach to study a phenomenon, whether it be idea, social event, artwork, is only the first step toward a project, toward solving a problem, toward answering a question. Decolonial thinking shifts the politics of knowledge toward problems and questions that are hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. And perhaps this is why there is this growing impetus and momentum amongst decolonization, because it is this shift towards the politics of knowledge, towards problems and questions that have been hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. So perhaps beginning to answer why it is that if we do a quick Google search of post-colonial versus of decolonial, there seems to be more engagement from many different types of communities about the decolonial in comparison to the post-colonial. Not to say that there has not been very important work done there. Again, if we think these binaries are useful. Right, so let's take a look quickly at different disciplines' approaches to decolonizing. So this is from Tariq Jazeel, speaking at the theme of the Royal Geographical Society's 2017 conference was around decolonizing of geography. And so this article then written, mainstreaming geography's decolonial imperative. And so at times when I am frustrated or pessimistic, perhaps, particularly if one is working with many economists, something like this makes me particularly hopeful. So, you know, having one of the most prestigious conferences have this as their theme, and to see Jazeel's reflections on where the discipline of geography is in terms of in terms of the decolonial imperative. So the real value of the conference theme is its assertion that the task of decolonizing geographical knowledge is now too important to be left to subfields like post-colonial geography alone, which is something that we often hear, you know, within economics departments or business schools, right? That if they are even open to having a discussion about what it might mean to decolonize economics, then at best, this is something that we will tack onto development economics, right? But certainly not, as we will see a little bit later, but Zain al-Abidine talks about this cross-cutting frame for what post-colonial thought would be for economics, not to create a sub-discipline, but to use this as a cross-cutting frame in many different subfields of economics, yes? But so it is often relegated, in the best instances, I would say, to maybe development economics, or perhaps then, oh, this is something that happens in the development studies department. We definitely do not associate the word economics with it. But to see this type of discussion amongst geographers, I think is really encouraging. I mean, for us to be able to say that post-colonial economics is now an established subdisciplinary field, you know, this post-colonialism meets economics of Zain al-Abidine and Charashila in 2004 being really the first of an attempt to be able to see how it is that post-colonial thought and economics can actually speak to one another. Definitely not an established subdiscipline within economics, I would say, at least buttressed by an increasing number of specialist undergraduate and graduate modules, books, handbook chapters, review essays, workshops, a dedicated book series at Rutledge. I would say this is not where the economics discipline is. But of course, a word of caution. Jazeel is saying that, you know, despite having dedicated much of his career to the importance of ensuring that the decolonial imperative within geography is not just this something that we tack on at the end, that he is suspicious of this professionalization of it. And so perhaps people might see this as they are despondent by it. I choose to be encouraged and excited by it. But I think, again, that this is so well put, that the prospect of confronting the challenge to decolonize our discipline is as dizzying as it is complex. Given the Herculean task ahead, efforts at decolonizing geographical knowledge will not be straightforward. Action must be practical, methodological, and theoretical, must be collective, cautious, confrontational, and unfailingly tentative, unafraid to fail, that is to say, which makes me ask many questions, right? For economics, I think we can take much from this to acknowledge how dizzying and how complex this is. I think that this is so well phrased that we need to be confrontational and unfailingly tentative, unafraid to fail. I would love to hear what participants' thoughts are around this idea that we're potentially going to embark upon how we can decolonize economics, and that we will invariably fail at this. So I think that this was a very important reflection for at least where geography as a discipline is, and a hopeful one for me at least. So because this is has a focus, this crash course has a focus, as I understand it, on ecological and feminist economics, I thought perhaps it would be interesting for some of you to see this piece that was recently made available of Trissos Auerbach and Cotti, titled Decoloniality and Anti-Oppressive Practices for a More Ethical Ecology. And so here is a discussion around many ecologists still rationalizing that organisms and ecosystems can be understood and stripped of their human-related histories of unequal social, economic, and ontological relations. And so perhaps a more pessimistic tone about how ecology, I think there are probably amongst the participants much more specialized knowledge around ecology. So I would love for whoever wants to engage on perhaps an assessment of where you might think ecology as a discipline stands when it comes to decoloniality, but perhaps a more pessimistic tone and approach than what we have seen with geography. But so an attempt to be able to get ecologists to grapple with this idea amongst the decolonial. I thought that what was interesting in this article, I'm going to show you in a second this image that they have created. But I thought what was interesting is to pause for a moment, because much of the decolonial literature and thought around this is to ask questions relating to languages, particularly that we're having these discussions in the English language. But so South Africa has 11 official languages, of which one of the official languages is isiXhosa. And so I think what was so fascinating for me is to read this, of how languages are reflective of concepts that you can see here. Recent Western ecological concepts of social ecological or human natural systems are the de facto way of thinking in many non-European languages. So in Xhosa, the word then for indalo means both creation and nature. Kwezindalo means of or in nature. Umdali is the creator. And the implication is that people are located within the environment. And I think in asking questions about knowledge and knowledges, the interesting question here for me is, how is it that non-European languages can shed light on the way in which we could, for example, understand our relationship between human, between natural, between social, ecological, and how that knowledge is already embedded within the language, right? But if we are not going to de-center Eurocentrism, then these types of knowledges are certainly not going to be brought to the fore, right? They are not going to be used within a framework of better understanding some of the questions that we may have about trying to understand economic phenomena, for that matter. So I thought that this would be perhaps an interesting point to momentarily reflect on. And so again, to take a look at a image, which I think can be so powerful. So again, this article is trying to emphasize that they do not want to be prescriptive and that this is not an exhaustive framework, but that they have these 5 ways for us to think about what it might mean to have a decolonizing ecology, to decolonize your mind, drawing from Ndlovu-Gatsheni work here, I would say, to know your histories, to decolonize access, to decolonize expertise, and practical ethical ecology in inclusive teams. I do not have the time to be able to go into more detail around this, but if this is something that you're interested in, a recommendation for you to read a little bit more around the idea of decolonizing ecology. And so then an intersection of decolonial and feminist and degrowth. If I had known earlier, I think I may have set this perhaps as one of the mandatory readings, but Corinna Dengler, yes, someone who will have been giving a crash course here, having written what I think is such a fascinating, important piece, thinking through the different intersections between the decolonial, between the feminist, between the degrowth approaches. Again, don't have time to go into this, but perhaps in the session, we will have more of an opportunity to be able to see some of the ways in which these different frameworks and approaches speak to one another, which I think would be particularly interesting. But again, I think of the phrasing of Zain al-Abidine in talking about this cross-cutting frame that decolonial approaches can have, I think, to our teaching, our knowing, our research, all these. Right, so just having now tried to demarcate how different disciplines are approaching this idea of what it means to decolonize their disciplines, to throw a spanner in the works and to ask ourselves, but what about one of the 10 Ds in this decolonial turn that Ndlovu-Gatsheni is talking about? Number 5 is de-disciplining. Just a reminder, right, the way that he is phrasing this, liberating knowledge from disciplinary empires and academic tribes. So much to unpack there about asking ourselves, what does this mean in terms of unlearning in order to be able to relearn, yes? But what might this mean for economics? Can we even ask ourselves what it means to specifically decolonize economics? If within the broader conceptualization around decolonization might well be to de-discipline, can we, and how do we then ask questions of the specific whilst we are trying to liberate ourselves from disciplinary empires and academic tribes? How do we grapple with this tension? So I think, at least for me, my husband and I recently fought a big fight to be able to have the history of economic thought taught at our university for the first time ever. Not to say that this is the silver bullet to be able to decolonize economics, certainly not. But in us asking how we will construct a curriculum, where is the history of African economic thought, and what would we possibly teach? And so, as you will be able to see here, I've just taken an excerpt from the YSI's History of Economic Thought Working Group. If you type in History of African Economic Thought at Google, it's one of the first things that comes up, if not the first. And so if you just take a look at this that I've just screenshotted, to see firstly, encouraging researchers based in Africa to submit contributions to this severely understudied subject area. And then some of the recommendations here of the economic thought of African scholars. It was interesting for me to do this with the students and to just ask them to just do a quick Google search of each of the names that we see represented here. And then, you know, perhaps this is quite a crude way of going about it, but just to see the Wikipedia pages, right, of each of these scholars and to see what they are classified as, right? Political scientists and linguists and writers, and certainly none of them being classified as economists. None of them being given this title. I've put here this question: would any of these be considered economists? Which I think can make us ask all kinds of interesting questions around how do we even define what it means to be an economist, or to define the discipline of economics. I have a little bit on this in a second. But I think that, at least for me, this is one aspect that highlights the importance of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, especially in the history of African economic thought, because the clearly demarcated lines of here is your textbook on the history of African economic thought, in the way that, you know, most history of economic thought, having Aristotle and Smith and Keynes and Marx and Ricardo and white Western male men who have all contributed as the founding fathers to the history of economic thought. This does not exist in these clearly cut, ready-made textbooks. And so I think that this asks important questions for what is the way in which we begin to engage with the history of African economic thought specifically. Right, a quick tweet break, which I thought was perhaps an opportunity for us to smile a little bit around the call for interdisciplinary, multi or transdisciplinary even. Great thing about doing interdisciplinary work is you get to be told how wrong you are by people in multiple fields. So not for the faint of heart, but perhaps just a light moment, but much seriousness actually to consider there. Right, so specifically talking about decolonizing economics then. So to try and be quick about this one, because I think I'm keenly aware of time limitations. So this is also under the suggested readings as a chapter from Postcolonialism Meets Economics by Zainal Abidine and Charashila. But talking about this gap, separating the two disciplines of economics and postcolonial studies, and really calling for us to have these two, shall we say, disciplines then speak to one another. And some discussion that I think is very useful about why it is that postcolonial studies has not engaged necessarily with what it is that economists are doing, and what it is that economics is, how it is that economics has, to a very, very small extent, engaged with the very rich contributions from postcolonial and decolonial thought. And so I thought that this was just an interesting point for us to potentially discuss in asking what defines economics as a discipline. And Zainal Abidine and Charashila talking about that postcolonial studies, they would say, has been daunted by the highly quantitative grammar of economics. And so I thought I was seeing interesting points of convergence perhaps around a piece that recently Project Syndicate had posted that was written by Danny Roderick, talking about, in essence, how economics and economists are defined by this statistical tool, by this specific method of forward causal effects. And I mean, if we take a look here, economists are obsessed with, as Danny Roderick is putting it here, forward causal inference. And so he says that economists' research can really substitute for more complete works of synthesis, which consider a multitude of causes, weigh likely effects, address spatial and temporal variation. And work of this kind is more likely to be undertaken by historians and non-quantitatively orientated social scientists. If this is what defines economics as a discipline, we can't be surprised that economics has barely engaged with decolonization, is what I had put here. So I would love to hear more from all of you around this idea of whether this is what defines economics, whether this should be what defines economics. But I think if this is what is, at least in large part, defining economics, I think that we cannot be surprised by the fact that economists have not engaged with this. Of course, this opens us up to also ask questions about, should economists know their place? Should we leave other social scientists to do the type of work that they certainly know how to do better? Discussions by Fine and Milonakis about economic imperialism and how economics encroaches on the other social sciences. Many points of discussion, I think. Then we have briefly touched on this already, but that when Zainal Abidine and Charashila are talking about post-colonialism meeting economics, that it is not aimed at providing another subfield, particularly of economic heterodoxy, but rather this cross-cutting frame. And so, again, time limitations, but I think one of the interesting examples for me of what this might look like, to have this cross-cutting frame in the way in which we attempt to answer questions or to even ask questions in the first place. And this is actually in a Cambridge Journal of Economics article that Zainal Abidine had written in 2009. But she is pointing to this paper by Trolson, who is actually taking a look at 26 entrepreneurs in Tanzania and very, very briefly, is seeing that these entrepreneurs in Tanzania are investing in and spending a large amount of money on labor-saving technologies. And yet, when there is this technology that is able to replace labor, that the workforce that they have continues to be in the employ of these entrepreneurs. Now, quite astounded by this, Troelsen, quite astounded by this, and cannot understand why this workforce continues to be employed, particularly when these entrepreneurs have now invested in all of this labor-saving technology. And so Zain al-Abidine is talking about this here, but balancing business and family obligations in a way that seems to appear irrational to a Western observer, which I think is a great way for us to, as you can see here, Zain al-Abidine talking about this, to ask questions about, what does rationality mean, about self-interest, about efficiency, and particularly if these are concepts that have become particularly prominent because of a Western understanding of what rationality means, the importance of self-interest and efficiency within economics, then this can seem absolutely astounding to those who are working from very, very mainstream perspectives, and even within some heterodox perspectives, right? So to really ask ourselves how the decolonial as a cross-cutting frame can be useful in us better understanding the lived realities that we're seeing. Yes. So just to pause there for a moment. Here, I had hoped to be able to play for you a snippet, but I'm not sure about intellectual property rights and copyright infringement. So, acknowledging all the problems that come along with Netflix, this is a South African stand-up comedian to, again, engage with this idea, perhaps a little bit more around knowledges and where knowledge comes from. But I think it was really interesting for me. This has been released now this year. He's a stand-up comedian. His latest comedy special is titled Unlearning. I think this is a wonderful example of using humor. I do not know whether Luis Ogola has specifically decided or explicitly decided that he would want to make use of a cross-cutting frame of post-colonial and decolonial thought to be able to inform his comedy, perhaps. But I thought that it was interesting to see how in the mainstream, shall we call it, stand-up comedians are titling comedy specials this word unlearning. I'm not sure if he is familiar with Klostanova and Mignolo with Ndlovu-Gatsheni with this idea of unlearning. I do not know. But to ask ourselves, how do we decolonize in order to ask questions about who is considered the experts and what is expertise necessarily? Towards the end of this comedy special, he credits his mother with having taught him how to unlearn, and how he continues to try to unlearn many things around patriarchy, around racism, around his interactions with people. And so, I'm not sure in how many instances a stand-up comedy, much as it has a very rich history, I'm not sure how many, again, economists would consider this an opportunity to consider knowledge in a different form. But I thought that I would pause for a moment here to ask each of you whether you think things like a stand-up comedy special, when engaging with, we have seen this word unlearning within the decolonial literature, whether this is something that you would find useful or relevant or interesting. So I would love to have, again, a discussion on this one. So quickly then to just ask some questions around decolonizing teaching of economics. So yes, there is discussion certainly about critical and decolonial pedagogies, specifically within institutions of higher education, but to ask ourselves questions of how do we decolonize the teaching within our workplaces, within our societies, and how do we decolonize what it is that we teach ourselves even. So I unfortunately don't have the time necessarily to elaborate on each one of these, but just to think through when we say, how do we decolonize the teaching of economics, that this does not have to be limited to the formal classroom setting. within institutions of higher education. Not to say that that is not a massively important place for us to ask these questions around decolonizing economics. So this was also one of the pieces of core content that I had recommended. So this is a working paper by Ingrid and Serbi, which makes me very excited when I see that we have economists. I don't know, I should actually ask them if they would identify as economists, but some fascinating findings here in having asked, I think, 498 economists in various departments, some questions around decolonizing the economics curriculum. And again, not enough time to be able to go through all of this, but showing here, do you think there's a problem with traditional economics education? And 3.81% are saying yes, that it does need to be decolonized. Of course, we could also make arguments that ensuring that it is less Eurocentric, that it is not as textbook based, that it is drawing from students' experiences, that it is more pluralist. All of these things we could argue falls within a broader decolonizing movement. But I perhaps just wanted to pause for a moment on 3.8% actually saying, yes, it does need to be decolonized. I would love to be able to unpack that a little bit more. Also here, taking a look at the percentage who chose the following options as ways to make economics education as relevant and realistic as possible. So you can take a look in their paper at this table 6, but I think that this quote is perhaps a point for us to reflect on and to discuss. So strikingly, the answers that have the lowest number of respondents are the ones that do deal directly with decolonization, such as breaking down the common idea of who is an expert, including more about colonialism and empire, and seeking to include prospective scholars and case studies from the global south. They are perhaps quite pessimistic about the mainstream being open to specifically the types of the different types of ways in which specifically we can deal directly with decolonizing the curriculum, and where this is not just diversifying the curriculum, but so they are a bit more optimistic about this within more heterodox departments. Again, I would be very keen for you all to share your insights with me around this. So I'm not sure how many of you are actually academics who would be looking to decolonize economics teaching in your classrooms, or how many of you are students that would want to engage in interesting discussions with your lecturers, with university management. But so these are some of the things that I have tried in my own classroom. And so maybe I would love to hear other ideas, or what it is that does or doesn't resonate with you as students or with you as academics, but really just to emphasize that embedded within decolonizing economics, the classroom, economic pedagogy, to recognize that this is embedded within decolonizing the university, decolonizing education at large, decolonizing our economies. And we'll come in a moment to the importance of not just using decolonizing as a buzzword, yes. But I would say that it is important for us to teach specifically about colonialism, about imperialism, about empire, about power within our economics modules at both undergraduate and postgraduate level. Not that this is, I mean, massive, gigantic battle for us to achieve this, but not that this is something that is relegated to an elective at postgraduate level and a subcomponent within perhaps a development economics course, yes? To be explicit in critiquing this idea that economists continue to propagate of economics as a science being neutral, of there being universality to it, of this absolute objectivity in economics. Something that I feel very strongly about, and often within, I think, within heterodox schools of thought, shall we say, is lots of focus on critique, of being able to deconstruct, which I think is massively important. Lots of the literature around pluralism, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking. But not just for us to deconstruct in our classrooms, but for us to also reconstruct, to see this as a positive project, and this process that we see is being discussed is a process by which we cannot only deconstruct, but I feel strongly we also need to reconstruct. I mean, perhaps this goes without saying at this point, but just to emphasize that it's not enough to add some scholars from the global south. This is vitally important, but it is certainly not enough. Not having this be relegated to development economics, and then talking about students being co-creators in their curriculum. Asking ourselves questions as academics, and for you as students, not that perhaps I do want to make lots of trouble if you're going back to your universities to ask your lecturers these things, but do your lecturers, do academics, do those in positions of power that are seen as knowledgeable and experts in their fields, do they actually see students as true partners? Or again, it is just this hierarchy of let me imbue you with this knowledge that I have encapsulated. So this is just a quick screenshot from my online learning platform. One of the things that I attempt to do in encouraging my students to be co-creators in their curriculum is to ask students what would they like to learn about, and then devoting at least 1 week. I mean, the bar is so low, we can have lots of discussions that this is not nearly enough in terms of what it means to decolonize. I would agree with this. But to ask students, what is it that they want to learn about? Some of the suggestions that my students had put down there, getting students to vote on this, and then in these weeks, getting students to present for them to be the ones that are seen as knowledgeable, not just the lecturer, but for them to, you can see here topics about the informal economy, about cultural economics, my students being interested in how the cannabis industry might aid development, right? But that the lived experiences of students is reflected, the African perspectives of development in their curriculums, and for them to know that they are partners in this journey of beginning to unlearn in order to relearn. So questions that we can certainly ask ourselves about: who are we teaching? Both our students and who are the scholars that we are teaching? Who is invited into the lecture hall to teach? I'll just pause here for a moment. If we are discussing the informal economy, are we going to look to journals and book articles and to the experts that have made up panels on the informal economy? Or might we ask an informal trader to come and share the lived realities of what it means to be within the informal economy, and to share that with our students? One option. What are we teaching? How are we teaching? How do we assess beyond multiple choice and simply writing essays? I also ask my students, how would they like to be assessed? And some of the most creative and inspiring and wonderful pieces of work almost always come from students in their co-creators assignment, as I call it, where they have decided how it is that they would like to be assessed, beyond just multiple choice or writing an essay. Not to say that good writing is not important. Yeah, right, nearly done. So this is I suppose, blog piece by an academic from New Zealand. So Appleton, so she's titled this, "Do Not Decolonize If You Are Not Decolonizing." To emphasize, that the word decolonizing has been used a lot in this presentation, but to reflect for a moment and to be cautious about using this word because of the power that it holds, but also how it can come to mean nothing if it becomes but a buzzword. And as she says, to deploy in service of the structures that it was created to destroy. So, she speaks very strongly of not letting this be something that you are going to say, oh, well, I can't decolonize because it won't be a buzzword. So now I am exempt from having to do this. But to plan for the long term. And I think, to emphasize this part of decolonization being a process. But in the interim, in this long-term goal of decolonizing, she suggests other words that we might use, and she says to make it easy for us, all words that start with a D, right? And so to diversify our syllabus, to digress from the canon, to decenter knowledge and knowledge production, to devalue hierarchies, to disinvest from citational power structures, to diminish some voices and opinions in meetings while magnifying others. So to ask ourselves, when are we going to use the word decolonization? And when do we need to stop ourselves from using that word for us, just turning it into a buzzword, yes? Which relates to this piece that is often quoted by Tuck and Yang, titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And so for them, they do see decolonization. They explicitly state here, page 3 of the article, decolonization doesn't have a synonym. And they see this as bringing about the repatriation of indigenous land and life, not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. And so, I mean, there is debates here that this does not, this is an aspect of decolonization, but it does not fully encompass particularly this newer discussions that there are around decolonizing of knowledge production. And so arguments that dispossession of the land is just not the only aspect of colonialism. And so Ndlovu-Gatsheni, in this piece that I had recommended you all read, I think puts it well, that the decolonization of the 21st century questions the very rules of the game and has escalated the issue to the level of rethinking and even unthinking thinking itself, which, I mean, he's not directly addressing Tuck and Yang here, but I think is at least more where I would lie, that we do need to be cognizant of and think through when we are using the word decolonization, that we do not cheapen it. But I think for us to recognize the multi-dimensional conceptualization of decolonization and how useful that can be for our individual disciplines, whilst holding in our mind at the same time these tensions that exist of what it might mean for us to engage with de-disciplining within the broader decolonial process. Yes. Right. And so then, because this is titled Alliances for the Future, so I am part of Decon, which is a network, a collective that is working on diversifying and decolonizing economics. You're more than welcome to take a look at it. I unfortunately don't have enough time to be able to get into this, but I do think that students are a massively important alliance for the future, to keep academics accountable, to question the hierarchies of power. We've seen this with the 2015 and 2016 student movements here in South Africa, particularly, but globally. Certainly, we have seen the importance and the power that students hold. I think Twitter can be a really hopeful place sometimes. Some of the best engagements that I've had have been with DMs in Twitter. I think it's very important for us to see our alliances for the future in our communities and people outside of academia, people outside of the confines of what we necessarily deem as experts. And really, for each of you to ask yourself, who might be an alliance in your specific context, in your workplace, as academics or activists or policymakers, students, community engagement, right? What does that exactly entail? But to move beyond only this idea that it happens within, the confines of the ivory tower, as important as what it is for us to find alliances within that ivory tower. And so in closing, I just want to pause for a moment on this image. This is a picture taken by San Haffiji for a organization called Ground Up. The images can be used under their Creative Commons license. And so this is a picture of a student during the 2016 protests here in South Africa of Fees Must Fall, where students were calling for a free decolonized education. Definitely do not have time to be able to get into everything that this movement entails. But this picture does more for me sometimes than a lot of the more formal academic literature can, when I ask myself, what does decolonization mean? Why might it be something that I would hope to be able to work on, to encourage others to get involved with, whether it be just in your everyday life, in the more formal ways of our research and academia and teaching. But it makes me ask myself, when students were protesting for a free decolonized education, and we saw the militarization of our universities, and we see, you know, a student giving a police officer a flower in this moment, it is more powerful for me than any text can be. I would love, for when we have our session, for each of you to tell me what it is that this photograph, this piece of art really evokes within you. And for you to reflect on, what questions does this bring up for you? What questions about power, about colonialism, about empire, about Eurocentrism, about, for me at least, what does it mean to be a university in Africa, or an African university? And really, what is it about students calling for a free decolonized education that I think so threatened the modern colonial matrix of power, as Slotsnova and Ndlovu would talk about, that it was met with such violence? So, you know, with that in closing, I think that asking ourselves what it might mean to decolonize economics can be daunting and scary and very uncomfortable, that it will make us have to ask some really difficult questions, that we may not even know what are the questions that we even need to ask, never mind begin to find answers for that, whatever answers may entail. But I think, if anything, for me, it is exciting. And I would hope that it is exciting for all of you, that this is an opportunity for us to do exactly that, to ask questions, certainly to deconstruct, but also to be excited about then constructing anew. There we go. That's that. Thank you so much. I so look forward to our sessions, and I would love for us to be able to better co-create in the time that we have with one another around this idea of what it might mean to decolonize economics. Have a good one, everyone.